Hello and welcome to Broad History, a podcast about the history you think you know with women in it this time. I'm your host, Isabel Rugal. I was wrong. I had a few lines about Phillis Wheatley Peters in a viral video through which many of you found this podcast, and they were imprecise and incomplete, which really all adds up to inaccurate. It's not that I didn't read up before recording, it's that I didn't read deeply or recently enough to catch the latest developments in scholarship. Because a lot of what we know, or what we thought we knew, about Phillis Wheatley Peters has changed quite recently, and a lot of what you'll find online about Phillis, including her Wikipedia page, is outdated, especially when it comes to the last few years of her life. It's an important reminder that everything we know in history, even when it comes from serious work, is open for reinterpretation, for additions and corrections as research evolves. And that is the collective endeavor of very many scholars. Hopefully today's episode with one of those scholars, Phillis's biographer, Vincent Carretta, helps us get a fuller and more accurate picture of a woman who was the first published African-American poet, arguably one of the first American international celebrities, really, and a literary sensation who took a distinctly American voice and culture to the world stage just as the colonies were starting to agitate for their liberty. A tremendously impactful life, tragically cut way too short. And it all started in transportation and slavery. Vin Carretta, hello and welcome to Broad History.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
My great pleasure. I'm very excited to talk about Phillis Wheatley Peters today. And I think something that gets probably a bit glossed over in the 250th commemorations that we're going through at the moment is that this era of the Revolutionary War is also the peak of the transatlantic slave trade. And in those years, or shortly before those years, we have a young girl who is transported to America. And that's kind of where I want to start. Obviously, spoiler alert, she's going to turn out to be Phillis Wheatley Peters. What do we know about Phillis at that point?
Well, actually, surprisingly, we know much more about how she got to Boston than we do about any other person of African descent in the 18th century. And that's really quite extraordinary because we have the manuscript correspondence between the owner of the slave ship that brought her from Africa to America and the letters that he wrote to the captain of the slave ship, directing him, in this case, for the voyage that brought Phillis to Boston. The owner tells the captain, do not do what you did on the last voyage. Do not bring little children and girls. Do not buy them because they have very little market value here. So this is actually significant, I think, when we're talking about where Phillis probably came from in Africa and how she arrived in Boston. So she arrived in Boston in the summer of 1761. She was about 7 or 8 years old. We know that because she was missing her front teeth. And she was purchased by Susanna and John Wheatley. John Wheatley was a transatlantic merchant. Susanna Wheatley was a very active evangelical Christian who had transatlantic connections, which is extremely important in enabling Phillis to be published. And she was purchased by the Wheatleys almost to the day, about 10 years after the Wheatleys had lost one of their children, a daughter who died. And remarkably, on the tombstone of the daughter who died, whereas we're used to seeing birth date, maybe month, day, year, then death date, in this case, the daughter's tombstone gives the year, the month, and the number of days that she lived. So she was clearly a very dear daughter to the Wheatleys, especially to Susanna. And what I suspect happened is that For Susanna, Phyllis was something of a substitute for this lost daughter who had died at almost exactly the same age. She died at about 7 years and 9 months, and I think it was something like 21 days old. And so this is, I think, significant again for the relationship that developed between Susanna and Phyllis, who Phyllis in private letters after Susanna's death referred to her as what we would call virtually foster mother. She said, I've lost a parent here.
Oh,
And
wow.
again, this is not psychologically that's surprising when you think that Phyllis
She
came
was so
as,
young.
right, as 7, 8 years old. She was well treated, relatively speaking. She was enslaved, but as a child that young, she wouldn't have had any more agency as a white child as she did as an enslaved child to someone who, from both sides of all the records that we have and their own private comments, had a virtually a quasi-familial relationship.
Right. It's almost like, not that any of this excuses kidnapping a child from her country and her family. They're treating it almost as an international adoption, it sounds like.
That's a good way of thinking it from Susanna Wheatley's perspective,
Yes,
probably.
of
And
course.
we don't even know. We assume that Phyllis was kidnapped as a small child, but that's not necessarily so. Some children who were enslaved in Africa were sold to pay debts. So the parents could have voluntarily, to the extent that, you
Under duress.
voluntarily, when you
Yes.
have no real feel you have no real choice. She could have been a debt payment, and we don't know that. I think the default is that she was kidnapped as a child. But as I say, from those letters from the owner of the ship to the captain of the ship, as a small child, she would have been classified as what they called in the 18th century a refuse slave, someone who had very little market value because she had very little labor value. And so she would have been one of the last purchases for this captain as he went down the coast of Africa to pick her up, to fill his cargo. It's terrible to talk about people in this way, but that's the way they thought of enslaved people. And the newspaper account of the arrival of the ship says the ship arrived from the windward coast, which is much farther down. That's sort of the area of present-day Guinea in Africa, which is much farther down and the west coast of Africa than Senegal and Gambia.
Her name reflects that her first name, Phyllis, is the name of the ship that she's
Correct.
transported on, right?
Right.
And Wheatley obviously is her enslaver's last
Right.
name. She is marked with that story in her.
Which is one of the reasons that a number of us are now preferring to refer to her as Phillis Wheatley Peters, because, as you say, Phyllis is the name of the slave ship, is almost like having a tattoo. Wheatley, the name of her owners. And Peters, though, comes from the man that she married, who himself had been born into slavery in America. The name he was given was Peter. And once he gained his freedom, he played with various surnames, and he eventually chose Peters. And so those of us who have taken to referring to her as Phillis Wheatley Peters do so because his was a freedom name, as we would call it, and as was so called in the 18th century, a name that he chose for himself. So by marrying him, Phyllis comes as close as she ever did to choosing a freedom
Yes.
name one step away or something.
Yes, and we'll talk about John Peters and her marriage in a bit. We'll go back to her childhood, but it's true that she never renamed herself in the way that Elizabeth Freeman did, for
Correct.
instance, right? So we don't have any other name but her enslaved name to refer to her besides Peters, which we'll absolutely use. So you mentioned her enslavers, her owners, the Wheatleys, are evangelical, and
Well,
or
especially
she is
Susanna.
Susanna.
Yeah,
Okay,
we're
and
not so sure about John.
right, and so that plays a role in the education that they give Phillis, and even choosing to educate her. Is that right?
Absolutely. As an evangelical, Susanna believed that she was obligated to expose anyone within her circle to Christianity. And in New England, that meant to give them access to the Bible, which meant give them access to literacy. And Phyllis very quickly demonstrated that she was a quick study. I mean, within 4 years, she was attempting to write poetry in English,
Not her native language,
not her
mind
native
you.
language. We can be absolutely certain of that. And so she not only showed herself to be a quick study, but think of Susanna and John Wheatley's interest in educating Phyllis was not completely selfless. She soon became what we would call the secretary for John Wheatley. A number of his business letters are written in her hand, in Phyllis's handwriting. So she was obviously taking what we would call taking dictation for him. So she had a profit value for him. And on Susanna's side, yes, she had this obligation to teach her, give her access to literacy, but also it reflected well on the Wheatleys, their own religiosity, to have this um, child prodigy uh, and publicly display her. So it was like a public display of their own, and especially Susanna's religious beliefs.
There is that sense I felt in her early fame of her being a curiosity. You know, there's her literary talent, but there's also the package it comes in as a young black girl that was perhaps unexpected, that seems to add to the interest perhaps in her work.
Sure, and she becomes, in that sense, I mean, if we're talking in the materialistic way that people talked about enslaved people in the 18th and 19th centuries, that Phyllis becomes almost like the Mercedes Benz or the super Tesla that you park in your driveway so everyone can see. You know, there's a reflection on you, the owner, in multiple ways that you have the leisure to give such a person access to literacy. I mean, people who came and visited the Wheatley's house to see Phyllis, to give her poetic assignments to see if she can write the poem, to test her, comment on things like she had a Bible. She was given access to a Bible and a dictionary. Now, how many enslaved children do you think were given dictionaries
Yeah.
in the 18th century? So this is all a way of, I don't want to deny the selfless motivation of someone like Susanna, but we need to keep in mind that these are practical people and they were actually like us in being human beings. And so they had complicated motives for doing good and doing well by doing good.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's definitely a lot piled into that relationship in those people. So we mentioned her fame as a young prodigy. So when does she start actually publishing poems, and how quickly does fame come when she starts writing?
The word publish, when we talk about it in the 18th century, we need to keep in mind that it covers not only print, but circulation. Most people circulated, published their work, especially women in the 18th century, through manuscript circulation. And so we know that Phyllis was writing. This is another extraordinary thing about Phyllis. is that we have copies of her manuscript poems, poems that were never published, but that people during her lifetime are talking about having seen copies of. So they were published in the sense of manuscript circulation.
How does that work?
And
Does she hand copy her poems, 10, 20, 100 times? How does that work?
well, we have instances of several of her poems. And again, this is extraordinary. We don't have this kind of record for most people, certainly not in America at this time. A number of her earliest poems, there are several versions of the same poem, right? And so we can assume that those circulated separately, but it's also possible that the same poem was circulated. Now, remember, Boston is pretty small. It's got about 15,000 people. And when you subtract the children, and you're talking about a fairly small number of people among whom these would circulate. And again, we have examples of women who copied Phillis's poems and circulated them, their own copies. And these are of poems that were never printed, ultimately. Her first manuscript circulation that we know of, it was circulated when she was about 10, 11, 12, something in that age range. So we know that she was writing poetry that early. The first published poem was published in 1767 when she was about 14 years old. And when I teach this to students or talk to students about this, now how many of you have published a poem when you were 14? Please raise your hand.
Not a lot of hands, I guess.
No, not a lot of hands. It's not overwhelming. And so that was published in a newspaper in Newport, Rhode Island, almost certainly through Susanna's evangelical contacts that she was able to get that published. And of course, that is a religious poem. So that was the first one. The one that really gives her transatlantic and ultimately international reputation is in 1770 when George Whitefield, the very famous evangelical Methodist minister, died on his 7th preaching tour to America. And he had recently just preached several times in Phillis's church. He may well have stayed with the Wheatley when he was in Boston. And she wrote a poem, published a poem, an elegy on his death, and she sent a copy to his patron in England, the Countess of Huntingdon. Outside of the Queen of England, she was probably almost certainly the wealthiest woman in England because she had the virtue of having had her husband die. And
always a convenient way to get rich.
it was the only way.
Yes, for a woman, yes.
For a woman in this period. And so she gained all of his wealth. She was at the center of a missionary network. She sent missionaries to America and throughout England as well. And so Phillis, at this point, she's about 17 years old. Again, I can ask my students, and you get about the same number of hands. But to think about, here was this enslaved girl. She sends a poem and a letter to the Countess of Huntingdon. This is not done.
That's pretty bold. That takes
yes.
confidence and courage. And
yes. Now, Susanna was a correspondent of the Countess. She had that connection, but still, Phillis sends us on her own. She's not sending it via Susanna. She's apologetic, but again, that's conventional.
Yes, it's in the social hierarchy.
Right.
Be very subservient.
And so she sends us this poem to the Countess. The poem was published first in Boston just a few weeks after Whitfield's death, and then republished in London And so Phyllis gained at least transatlantic, if we don't want to call it international reputation from that. So she's on her way.
She's on her way, and she's on
As a
her way
teenager.
literally,
Right.
because that's when she travels to England. So she crosses the Atlantic again in the other direction to go to
And
England.
one thing we tend to forget that by doing that, I think we can argue becomes the most famous American poet in the 18th century, certainly up to that point.
I want to talk about her style and what she writes. I mean, as you say, very much steeped in evangelical Christianity. I've seen you speak about her using the words "we Americans." So it's like it's claiming an American identity for the colonies and then for Black Americans as well, to be part of that group of Americans. Is that new? Is that something that she pioneers in her writing? Can we say that she represents something about American identity at that point, or?
Her identity is complicated. I should have qualified, I suppose, and said that she's the most famous poet from America,
From America.
writing
Okay.
in America. Because at this point, Americans are all British
Yes, we're
Americans.
before the Declaration of Independence, right?
Before
We're
the
still a few
Declaration.
years.
But we have to keep in mind that people of African descent in this period are denied a national identity, especially people who are enslaved. So when we talk about her identity in a national sense, we have to consider at what point is she claiming an American identity. And she's writing through personas. She creates voices. Even in as early as the Whitfield Elegy, she uses we to talk about we Americans, but she also uses the we to talk about we people of African descent in that poem. And she'll do this in a number of poems. Eventually, what I argue is she's making a claim to being, in effect, the unofficial poet laureate of the new United States. By the time of her late poem, Liberty and Peace, it's in 1784, when there is now a United States of America. And she's still expressing hope that people like her will be fully accepted and that this revolutionary ideology will be extended to everyone.
Does she express views on slavery itself in her writing?
She does, and again, I'll keep I have to keep qualifying. It depends on the context, the time that she's writing. There's a difference between when she's writing as an enslaved person and after she gains her freedom in 1773. And this is a big issue for literary critics and historians too, who are looking for intimations of resistance in her poetry, how indirectly she may be making comments or commenting on slavery and demonstrating opposition, which she has to be very careful about, would have to be very careful about while she's still enslaved. A very clear turning point is in early 1774. Her book is published in 1773, published in London, does not get distributed in Boston until early 1774 because the copies came over just as the Tea Party. They arrived in time for the Tea Party.
Lucky they didn't land in the arbor.
Right, right. That they didn't confuse the boxes or the bales or whatever. But so Susanna Wheatley dies in the first week of March of 1770. And the next week, a newspaper, or actually a lot of newspapers in New England, publish part of a letter from Phyllis to Sampson Occam, who was a Presbyterian Native American minister, in which Phyllis directly attacks slavery. And it's one of the few examples in which she uses sarcasm, accusing enslavers of being modern Egyptians. And how can they possibly reconcile their calls for freedom for themselves with their enslaving others? She ends by, I'm paraphrasing, she says, you know, it doesn't seem obvious that there's a problem here.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm. That's interesting. That's like maybe getting a glimpse of the private person when she's not being as careful in the way that her published writings might have had to
mm,
be careful.
I think the timing is at least interesting that she doesn't do this, or it doesn't happen until Susanna dies.
Yeah.
And so if it had happened sooner, it could have been seen as a reflection of criticism of her enslaved state, enslaved to Susanna, whereas waiting, maybe it's all coincidental. With so many things about Phyllis's writing, we can't be sure whether there are causal connections or coincidental events
Mhm.
that we're dealing with.
It
But
it
I
it
like
wouldn't
to think
be yeah. It wouldn't be
my
the first time that a writer chooses to wait and protect a parental figure to publish certain things,
right,
certainly.
right. And biographers tend to, and I'm certainly guilty of this, written more than one biography now, that you start to think of this as my ex as opposed to your ex, your version of someone. And so my Phyllis is very calculating in the positive sense,
Yes.
that she's very careful. She's very conscious of her audience and the personas that she's presenting, and when she's doing it, where she's doing it, to whom she's doing it, for whom she's doing it. She's a marketing genius, for example, to me, the way I see her operating,
Mm.
and all under constraints. She's always under constraints. When she's enslaved, she's obviously under constraint. When she's married, she's under constraint. She's under legal constraints because she's the legal property, if you will, of her husband in this
Yeah,
period.
every episode in this series, we have bumped against a curvature since we're
Right,
talking
right.
about women of the revolution. So she goes to England, meets some powerful people there, gets her book funded and published, comes back to Boston and is, as they say, manumitted, so is freed.
Mhm.
And we're going to take a quick break and then we're going to talk about her life in freedom after that time. So we'll be right back. We're back with Vin Carretta talking about Phillis Wheatley Peters. So we've talked about her fame. She publishes her book. She comes back from London and is freed.
She returns from London. She gets back in September of 1773. October 18th, she writes a letter. This is my favorite letter by her, in which she tells someone about her trip to London. And the first half of this letter, she sounds like the kind of overwhelmed young girl that she was. She was maybe 20 years old at this point. Goes to London. She tells him about, "Oh, went to the British Museum and I saw this and I saw that and I went to the Tower of London." She doesn't mention that when she was at the Tower of London, they had a small zoo and there was a wolf named Phyllis in
Oh.
the zoo.
I mean, London is a
Another
massive
captive.
city at the time compared to America is small towns. Even the biggest towns in America are quite
Right,
small.
right. Boston's about 15,000, London's about 700,000. So here's this small town girl going to the big city, and she's dazzled by it. The whole first half of the letter is written in the passive tense almost exclusively. They brought me here. I was taken there. Da, da, da. All these things happened to her. And she lists a number of these places that she saw, most of which are still major tourist attractions in London. And then suddenly in the second half of the letter, the transition she makes is that since she's returned, and this is just a few weeks between her arrival and this letter. She says, "I have been freed at the desire of my friends in England." And after that point, she goes to the active voice. "I did this. I'm doing this. I'm selling my books. You need to help me sell my books. I've autographed the ones here so you know that I will get the profits from them. I have sent a copy of my freedom papers," what we would call freedom papers, "to the agent in London representing New England so that they have a copy." And she says, "to protect whatever I make, any profits I make from my owners, from my former owners, now former owners." And what happens in London when she goes to the Tower of London, the tour guide that she has there is Granville Sharp, because he has an office at the Tower of London. And Granville Sharp is the man who had brought the court case that resulted in the Mansfield decision of 1772, almost exactly a year before he's meeting Phillis, in which the court ruled that no enslaved person brought to England could be legally forced back to the colonies as a slave. Phillis is like the example he's been living for, and it's inconceivable to me that the case didn't come up, the implication, the fact that all she has to do is say, "No, I'm not going back unless you guarantee that I'm going to be freed if I do so, and I'm gonna leave a copy of that agreement here," et cetera, et cetera. So that she's demonstrating agency and control at a very young age. And I think this accounts for why we go from a passive teenage voice to the active businesswoman voice in the second half. I mean, it's like watching someone turn from child to adult in a letter.
Yeah,
And
so
so
from
it's
Clark Kent to Superman or something.
right. So that's what happens there. And then as far as the marriage, and as Cornelia Dayton has demonstrated, uh, the marriage to John Peters is really very significant in helping us understand something more about Phillis, as well as in my earlier versions of my biography, I had come up with a really elegant explanation for why Phillis disappears from the record for several years in the early 1780s. And it was wonderfully elegant, except that as Cornelia Dayton's research discovered, my elegant explanation is completely wrong. So this
That's
is
the
how
beauty of research, right?
that's it,
We're
that's it,
constantly building
that's it.
collaboratively.
You know, when people ask me, "Well, what would happen if someone proved it wrong?" I'd say, "Thank you. This is a group project, recovering people's lives." So what happens in March of 1778, John Wheatley dies. Apparently, Phillis had been living with him, either, I assume, working for him, either salaried or getting room and board for doing so. He dies in March. In April, John Peters and Phillis Wheatley announced their intention to marry. They don't marry until Thanksgiving Day of 1778. At one point, they're sharing the same address. It's a boarding house, so we don't know whether they were living together. Shockingly, it will be living in sin, or they simply were both in the same boarding house. Anyhow, they do marry, and John Peters, like many people or most people in the 18th century, has multiple occupations. He calls himself at various times a physician, a lawyer. He calls himself a gentleman, which is really significant as he becomes a property owner eventually. And he had a very negative image from a 19th century biographer of Phillis, Martha Margaretta Odell, infamously calls him a kind of a snidely whiplash kind of character, this evil person who oppresses Phyllis, and Odell's Phyllis is sort of the opposite of my Phyllis. Odell's Phyllis is this passive figure who's under the thumb of John Peters. But John Peters was a hustler in the best sense of the word. He was always trying to get ahead, always trying to make a name for himself, which meant, especially in the 19th century, he was looked on as being arrogant, or in the 19th century term, uppity. That wasn't a term that was used in the 18th century. But so we have a couple of neutral descriptions of him, contemporaneous descriptions of him in the 18th century, one of which says he was tall, well-built, virile, manly,
It's like
things
an
that,
attractive husband.
well, it gives us a different possible way of looking at Phyllis herself as not this simply ethereal poet, or certainly not Odell's, "Oh, he's just gonna control me," as opposed to saying, "Well, this guy's a go-getter." To me, Phyllis and he are both ambitious, both self-confident, both wanna exercise as much agency as they can, and that they're psychologically well-balanced. There's not a dominance
Mhm.
here. She's not this passive, under his thumb kind of person. And so their marriage initially seems to be prosperous. He's traveling around. He's what we would call a retail merchant. The problem is that he gets into a lot of debt. And this is very common in the 18th century for people to go into debt, go in and out of debt in this period. And in 1780, he has a remarkable opportunity that comes up. His former owner, the man, dies. His widow then invites John Peters to come back and essentially take over the land and the house, as long as he takes care of her and her disabled daughter while they're alive. And he and Phyllis move back in. He rearranges the house. Again, he's seen by those who are inclined to do so as arrogant. Phyllis moves in with him. He insists that they be treated, and especially his wife, be treated as a lady. This is a Black woman
Mhm.
in a overwhelmingly white little town. And
You can tell when and I think Cornelia Dayton writes this very, very well, that you can tell that there is resentment at the idea of a successful Black couple, an educated, famous woman, a man who knows his own worth, showing up as propertied people in the town now. That
and
probably gained them a few enemies.
and she's not only educated, but she is far more
World
famous than
famous, yeah.
anybody in the town. And here they are expected to treat them as their social superiors, which they were, but at this time they couldn't be. They both were, but couldn't be. And yes, as you say, it aroused a lot of resistance, so much that eventually they're driven out of the town. They go back to Boston. Not that long after, John Peters is arrested for the debts that he had before they left Boston. And Phyllis dies in December of 1784. John Peters had been jailed for debt, certainly in September of 84. He was almost certainly Odell says he abandoned her. Well, he abandoned her in the sense that he was jailed for debt.
Yeah. Again, a very common
Was
thing, right? That has
extremely
risen both in
common.
England and in the
Right.
colonies.
He was in and out for years after Phyllis died until he finally really got on his feet years afterward.
And Phyllis, she had made some money from her first book. I assume she still had her pen to support herself, but it seems like all the people who had marveled at her talent and supported her first book just did not continue their support for her literary career once she was a free woman and an adult, it seems.
She addresses this in a letter to an English correspondent who had warned her that people may leave you when you're no longer enslaved, and because supporting you is also a way to curry favor with your owners. And she acknowledges that some people have left her. I take the title of my book from one of her Black British critics or commentators, Ignatius Sancho, who in 1778 was given a copy of her book. He didn't know at this time that she had been freed in 1773, and he calls her a genius in bondage, which is where I get my title from. And he compares these Boston people who had supposedly supported her as Pharisees who have abandoned her since. Now, how he knows this, I'm not sure, but he's dead on. We also have to keep in mind that what happens in 1773, already all this tension is developing between Britain and America. And when Phillis tries to get a publisher in Boston in 1779 for her second volume of poetry and letters, she was going to include letters, they can't find a publisher. But it's very hard to find a publisher in the middle of a war.
The American economy is in really bad shape, right, by the end of the Revolutionary War as well. I imagine even just having the paper to print and ink would be a challenge.
Right, and they're kind of preoccupied.
Yes.
People are preoccupied at the time. The war has started to turn in the rebels, the revolutionaries' favor after, the Battle of Saratoga in 77, and the French come in 78 on the American side. So the tide has started to turn, but Yorktown is still, it's late 1781, so we have years to go. And there are a number of reasons why they couldn't find a publisher. One of the reasons, I think, is they make the mistake, and I think John Peters is probably responsible for this, as advertising the book as to be published by Phillis Peters. No mention in the first advertisements of her as the former Phillis Wheatley.
Oh, so people don't recognize
Right,
the
right.
person.
And interestingly, when John Peters is presumably in debtor's jail in late 1784, the next time she advertises this book looking for subscribers, it identifies her as the formerly Phillis Wheatley, Phillis Peters, former. So that's why, again, my Phillis is this marketing genius who realized, okay, we got to let them know.
Yes, that
this
may
is
not have
not
been the
some
name she wanted to go by, but
new Phyllis,
yeah.
Um,
And so she dies in 1784. I think she had a couple children, neither of whom survived. And she really goes in a few short years from worldwide fame, or international fame at least, to dying in poverty, right? Or
what we know about her final days, we have to rely on Odell.
who
Odell
is
is an
biased.
unreliable witness. Odell says she had 3 children. Cornelia Dayton has pretty much confirmed that, and she's found the records that indicate that they had at least one child who presumably died early. And the way I read Phyllis's last published poem is that it's about the death of that child. It's an elegy that it's very much less optimistic than any other elegy that she writes. And it is about, the title says it's about the death of an infant. So whether she died in poverty, that may well be the case, since John is in debtor's jail. Now, her reputation after her death, it's a whole other story. Her reputation in overseas is actually pretty good. For example, she dies in 84, in 86, an Austrian, John Retzer, publishes a multi-volume anthology he calls it the choice of the best English poets. And of course, it's Shakespeare and all these familiar names. One American poet named Phillis Wheatley. She's the only one in there.
Mhm.
Of course, she's the only Black author as well. And she's the only one he has a little biography of, talking about its remarkable love, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Wouldn't expect this. So she had that reputation. She dies just as the transatlantic movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade is building up.
Mhm.
And in England, she is cited all over the place by people arguing that she demonstrates that people of African descent did not deserve to be enslaved, that they are intellectually as capable of literary achievement as any white person. In fact, one of these people says, if the absence of poetic ability justifies enslavement, then there are an awful lot of people here in England who ought to be enslaved. And it's in America that she gets much more grief. Of course, the whole situation in America involving slavery is very different. And the most notorious example is Thomas Jefferson in Notes on the State of Virginia, where he has a brief comment on Phillis Wheatley, and he says that religion could create a Phillis Wheatley, but could not create a poet. And totally dismissive
Yeah.
of.
Well, I wouldn't trust Thomas Jefferson's opinions on women, for one, from what I've seen of him so far, or on slavery.
But
So,
he was extraordinarily influential, as you might imagine, especially in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, as Henry Louis Gates Jr. points out, in the 1970s, during the Black Power movement, when we have a number of Black authors who were condemning Phillis in kind of neo-Jeffersonian terms. Some of them are calling her having a white mind, selling out to whiteness, and denying her Blackness, her Africanness. Now, all of that has been, as you can imagine, Gates, in some ways, has led the charge against that. You don't hear that today. I guess I'm not in touch with the real far right-wing MAGA movement. I'm not sure how they deal with
they probably
Phillis.
don't at all. Well, actually, and that's how I came across Honorate Jeffers, who I want to acknowledge here because she pointed out a lot of this more recent scholarship to me. Phillis Wheatley Peters is one of the only 4 women who are portrayed on the Freedom 250 website, which is the MAGA website for the semi-quincentennial. They made these horrible AI portraits of a number of figures of all the people who signed the Declaration of Independence and 4 lonely women. And Phillis Wheatley Peters is one. So there you go. They have claimed her somehow with a horrible and inaccurate AI portrait.
Well, as you reminded us, Honore Jeffers is the sort of fountainhead of the call for renaming Phillis. Honore Jeffers really raised the profile of that movement or this movement. I think we're winning.
Not yet on the Wikipedia page, unfortunately.
No, I don't know about it.
But on a lot of the scholarship, most of the scholarship, yes.
Well, legally, her name was never Phillis Wheatley Peters. It was either Phillis Wheatley or Phillis Peters. We say Phillis Wheatley Peters because Phillis Wheatley. It's the way she's known.
Yes, for the same
Yeah.
reason she put formerly Phillis Wheatley on the advertisement for that
Right,
book, right?
Good point. Yeah.
I think we've had a wonderful overview of her life and her influence. Thank you so very much for your time today.
Thank you. I enjoy spending time with you, and I always enjoy spending time with Phillis.
This was Vin Carretta. His book, Phillis Wheatley Peters, Biography of a Genius in Bondage, was re-edited in 2023 to reflect all of this new research. He's also edited her complete writings and written lots more about great Black literary figures of the 18th century, such as Olaudah Equiano and Ignatius Sancho. If you're up for something a bit different from the traditional biography, you can also read Honorée Jeffers. She published The Age of Phillis, a National Book Award longlisted collection of poems imagining the life of Phillis, and I want to acknowledge her here again and thank her for pointing me to all of this great scholarship. You'll find both books in a Broad History bookshop, as always. The link is in the show notes as well as in the newsletter, which you should absolutely sign up for if you haven't yet at broadhistory.com. And there you can also choose to support this independent podcast with a membership or small donation of your choice. It's at broadhistory.com/membership. I'll be back next week with the final biography in this series on the women of the American Revolution. We'll talk about Mercy Otis Warren, another great literary figure, but also a political figure. And we'll talk about political rights, political philosophy, the contribution of women to the ideas of the revolution, and whether the franchise was something that was even ever considered for us. So come back next week. Until then, this has been Broad History, and I've been your host, Isabelle Rogol. Music by Aaron Kenny. I'll talk to you next week.